In August 1969, while stationed in Da Nang, a city on the south-central coast of Vietnam, U.S. Marine Earl Morrison, along with his fellow soldiers, watched in shock as a strange winged creature flew into their camp. Morrison described the creature as a naked, black-skinned human-like female with large dark wings. She hovered over the men, gazing down at them, at one point even blocking out the moon. Eventually she drifted off, flapping her wings and disappearing into the night, leaving the Marines scratching their heads at what they had just seen. This classic case, often referred to as the Winged Woman of Vietnam, has been covered by a number of authors, including the late John Keel. Even people with a passing interest in the paranormal have probably heard of this incident. Exactly 1 year before the Winged Woman arrived out of the darkness of the night to spook those Marines, there was another bizarre incident that happened in the forests of Vietnam that is just as frightening, though not nearly as well known. UFO researcher Solomon Nafford, in a May 17, 2004 issue of the newsletter NLO, issue 338, wrote of the case in an article titled Black Sphere in the Jungles of Vietnam. One of the central witnesses to the event, Boris Ivanov, provided Nafford with his extensive notes detailing the event. It is definitely one of the more chilling UFO encounter stories ever to emerge out of Vietnam. August 12, 1968, 5 Soviet engineers, working to construct a hydroelectric power plant in an isolated region near Chao Bang, North Vietnam, were awakened by the rumble of engines overhead. Assuming it was American B-52 bombers, the men scrambled out of their tents. When they looked up into the darkened sky, they were surprised to see, not bombers, but a black, angular, diamond-shaped object, approximately twice the size of the moon, which emitted a greenish-blue light. A few tense moments later, the darkness of the night would soon be replaced by a blinding white light, as a fiery comet-shaped object shot across the sky, apparently launched from somewhere on the ground, and impacted the diamond-shaped object. Immediately there was a bright flash, which blinded everyone, and then a powerful shockwave, which knocked the hydrologists off their feet, ripping apart their tents and flinging their equipment in every direction. Aside from a few minor scratches, the men, for the most part, were unharmed. Not surprisingly, they were deeply concerned about what they had just witnessed, and even contemplated that a small nuclear device had exploded over them. For the next few hours, they were not able to call out with their radio and other communication equipment. Every attempt was met with only static. It wasn't until morning that their equipment began to work properly, and they were able to alert the base to the events of the previous night. Looking to fill out a report, the men visited the closest village. To their surprise, there was nothing to indicate that anything had exploded anywhere near the village. As well, the inhabitants they spoke to reported hearing only a, quote, loud thunderstorm the previous evening. Nothing out of the ordinary. About 2 days later, after scouring the area of woods where they had camped the night of the explosion, the men stumbled upon an amazing sight. A black, half-sphere-shaped object, about 3 meters in diameter. They discovered it about 1 kilometer from their base camp. They noticed that the surface of the sphere was completely black. It seemed that light did not reflect from its surface. Also, the sphere did not cast a shadow. The rays of the low evening sun seemed to go around the object, falling on the high grass around it. Upon touching it, the men noted that it was cool and slippery, as if sprayed down with cold soapy water. When one of the men tried to scratch the object with his knife, he found he couldn't. They reached out to the base about their peculiar find, and were promptly instructed to set up a protective perimeter around the sphere, and guard it until a, quote, special group arrived at the site. They were told to absolutely not touch the object or get within 20 meters of it. The men could only wonder if the sphere was some type of secret weapon, possibly of Soviet or American origin. After laying down their bedding and getting a fire going, the 5 men sat around the fire chatting. Boris Ivanov noted that the men, although armed with rifles, felt very uneasy and could only stare at the object by the light of the fire as they waited for the arrival of the Special Forces unit. Over the next few hours, something very bizarre and frightening began to play out. It began when Vyacheslav stood up and walked off in the direction of the spear, into the dark forest behind it, away from the fire. The men assumed that he was merely relieving himself, but when he failed to return after 5 minutes, they began to sense that something was amiss. They called out to him, but received no response. They continued to wait, but Vyacheslav did not return. With flashlights and weapons in hand, the men cautiously went about searching the area where they had seen him wander off, but they could not find him. A little afraid, the men decided to halt the search and return to camp. About 1 hour later, one of the other men, Peter, silently rose up from his bedding and wandered off in the same direction that Vyacheslav had gone. Ivanov noted that he seemed to be rocking back and forth as he walked. At this point, Ivanov and the other remaining men were overcome with a deep sense of fear and anxiety, and they made no attempt to search for Peter. They merely sat by the fire and waited. Like Vyacheslav, Peter never returned. Another 2 hours passed, and this time Vladimir stood up, and, as if under somebody else's control, he wandered off towards the sphere, disappearing into the dark woods. He also never returned. Only Boris and Sergei remained. The 2 men stared at each other, terrified about what might come next. Both wanted to leave, run away, but both, for some inexplicable reason, could not. Ivanov wrote of what happened next, that Sergei's face suddenly became distorted. He stood up and wandered off in the direction of the sphere, like a weak-willed marionette, eventually disappearing into the canopy of trees and darkness. As he sat and waited, Boris suddenly found himself able to move again. In an instant, he realized that he was next. In a desperate move, Ivanov quickly grabbed his rifle and proceeded to shoot a round into his own leg, which sent him flopping to the ground in pain. By taking this action, Boris not only impeded his ability to walk, it also seemingly broke the hypnotic grip the sphere had over him. Boris lay by the fire writhing in pain, eventually passing out from it. When Ivanov awoke the next morning, he found himself surrounded by special forces. He had lost a lot of blood but was still alive. The giant bonfire had burned down to nothing. As well, the sphere was now suddenly gone, along with his 4 associates. Boris was evacuated from the area, and a quick search was conducted of the area. His comrades were never seen again.